You're black. You've paid. You've planned. And now they want your seat. What would you do? Stay silent or stand up? Meet Jasmine Hill, a 17-year-old black girl with a future brighter than the sky she's flying through. Smart, quiet, composed. She boarded this flight with nothing but a ticket, a book, and a promise from her father. Everything's taken care of. But what happens next? No one could have predicted. When a wealthy white passenger decides she doesn't belong in first class, what starts as a whisper turns into a public humiliation. She's ignored, judged, removed, all because of how she looks, not who she is. But Jasmine isn't alone. Her father? He's not just any parent. He's a federal agent. And when he returns, truth hits like turbulence. This isn't just a flight. If you've ever felt underestimated, misjudged, or unseen, this story is for you. Tell us in the comments. Where are you watching from? Have you ever witnessed something like this? Smash that like if you believe silence is never weakness. Subscribe for more stories that expose what's hidden. And don't forget to hit the bell, because the next twist, you won't see it coming. Gregory West moved down the aisle of first class with the slow, entitled pace of a man convinced the space belonged to him. His polished brown loafers creaked against the plush carpet, while his expensive cologne trailed behind him in a cloud of false sophistication. His ticket read to a window seat premium cabin, but as he reached his row, he stopped short. In 2B, the adjacent seat, sat a black teenage girl, small frame, brown hoodie, dark skin marred by faint pitted scars along her jawline. Her carry-on bag was tucked neatly under the seat in front of her, and she sat with quiet posture, earbuds in, flipping the pages of a dog-eared novel she held with both hands. She looked out of place, not because of anything she was doing, but because Gregory had already decided that she didn't belong. He stared at her for a moment, lips curled, then turned to the nearest flight attendant with a snap of his fingers. "Excuse me," he said, gesturing toward Jasmine like she was clutter in his assigned space. "I think someone's wandered into the wrong section." Karen Blake, the lead flight attendant for the flight, approached briskly, her practiced customer service smile frozen in place. She glanced at Jasmine, then at her tablet. "No, sir," she said after a moment, her voice measured. "That's C2B. It's correct." Gregory laughed under his breath and raised an eyebrow, his tone dry. "Sure. I'm just surprised. I thought this was first class, not a student discount raffle." His words cut through the cabin, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Jasmine didn't react. She kept her eyes on the book, though the page trembled slightly in her hand. Gregory turned back to Karen, voice mockingly light. "Maybe check again. Maybe your pass printed wrong. These things happen when you start letting everyone in." Karen's mouth tensed as she glanced back down at the manifest. Her ticket scanned correctly. "She's a confirmed first-class passenger, sir." Gregory didn't hide the smirk spreading across his face. He looked Jasmine up and down slowly. "Well, isn't that something? You here alone, sweetheart." Jasmine glanced up, eyes steady but silent, and shook her head faintly before returning to the page. She didn't answer. She couldn't. The heat rising in her chest was familiar. She'd known it since grade school, since neighborhood shops, since the last time someone called her sweetheart through gritted teeth. "Guess these days they let anyone in here," Gregory added to no one in particular. "Suppose next flight I'll be sitting next to someone with livestock." His voice dripped with smugness, and when Karen didn't respond, he chuckled to himself and slid into 2A, the seat beside Jasmine, making a show of tossing his jacket onto the middle armrest, so it spilled slightly into her space. Karen, face tight, gave Jasmine a brief glance, something between awkward apology and dismissal, then walked away. Jasmine adjusted her posture slightly to avoid Gregory's elbow. Her hand stayed locked on her book. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't breathe too loud. She couldn't. Gregory took a call seconds later, putting his phone on speaker just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Yeah, I'm here," he said. "In first class. Sitting next to some scholarship case. Looks like the airline's doing outreach now." He laughed to himself, clearly pleased. No, she's a teenager. Looks like she borrowed her hoodie from a lost and found. Jasmine's spine stiffened. Her fingers pressed tighter to the page, but she didn't look up. The man's voice was like static in her skull, but she had nowhere to go. She was already strapped in, trapped with her silence and her shame. She had no father beside her, no one to intervene, no power to call on, no voice anyone would listen to. Gregory leaned toward her slightly, eyes squinting as he studied her cheek. "That eczema? Or chickenpox scars?" he asked casually. "Man, the lighting in here is unforgiving." Jasmine said nothing. She turned the page. Her heart pounded, but her body didn't flinch. A woman across the aisle shifted uncomfortably, then buried her face deeper into her tablet. No one spoke. No one stopped him. First class had turned into a stage, and Jasmine was alone under the spotlight, left to perform grace while being slowly peeled apart. Gregory reclined in his seat with a sigh, muttering, "Let me guess. Mommy saved up every paycheck for this seat? Or maybe this is a make-a-wish thing." His voice dropped to a whisper. "What do you got, sweetie?" "Skin cancer." Jasmine's lips pressed together. Her throat burned. Her knuckles whitened against the spine of her book. But she didn't blink, didn't run, didn't speak. She knew her place. And at 38,000 feet in the air, she had no choice but to stay in it. Gregory West hadn't finished. Not even close. The seatbelt sign hadn't yet lit up, and already he was pushing for escalation. With an exaggerated sigh, he pressed the overhead call button and leaned back in his seat like a king summoning a servant. Karen appeared seconds later, her smile now thinner, more strained than before. "Yes, Mr. West." He pointed a thumb toward Jasmine without looking at her. "We need to verify again. I don't care what the scanner said. I've been flying first class longer than some of your crew's been alive, and I know a fraud when I see one." Karen's jaw twitched slightly. "As I said, sir, her boarding pass is valid. She's registered on the manifest." Gregory shook his head, clicking his tongue in faux disappointment. "You know, I was trying to be subtle earlier. Didn't want to make a fuss. But now you're putting this entire cabin at risk of a security breach. Are we not doing ID checks anymore?" Jasmine didn't move. Her eyes stayed fixed on the book she was no longer reading. She wasn't listening to the words anymore, only the tone, the twisted satisfaction in Gregory's voice. It was the same tone she'd heard from teachers who didn't see her in advanced classes, from store managers who had to double-check her card, from people who smiled while shrinking her into something unworthy. Karen tried again, softer this time. "Mr. West, she's a minor, and she's traveling with full authorization. Everything's in order." Gregory scoffed loudly. "Minor? Yeah. Well, so are a lot of hustlers these days. How old do you think these identity scams start?" He turned to the older man across the aisle, who gave a small, uncomfortable chuckle in return. "You know what I think? I think she's sitting here because someone screwed up. And now everyone's too afraid to say it because, God forbid, someone's feelings get hurt." He dropped his voice, leaned closer to Karen. "Look at her. Look at the skin. You think her parents are flying first class? Come on." Karen hesitated, then glanced toward the front of the cabin. "Would you like me to call the flight supervisor?" Gregory smirked. "You should call security. Or the air marshal. Hell, call someone with a badge. If this turns out to be what I think it is, and you ignored it, it's your job on the line, not mine." Jasmine could feel her heart beating, so loudly it drowned out the cabin noise. She kept her chin down, posture still, trying not to breathe too loud, too wrong, too anything. She had heard every word. She knew exactly what he was implying, and she knew silence wouldn't save her. But it was the only thing she had left. Karen returned 2 minutes later, this time with a young male attendant named Trevor and a clipboard in hand. Trevor avoided eye contact with Jasmine as he leaned in toward Gregory. "We've reviewed the manifest. There's no error." Gregory barked a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah, of course. Everyone's covering their own ass now." He turned toward Jasmine for the first time in minutes. "Tell you what, kid. You hand over that boarding pass right now, and we'll let the grown-ups figure out where you actually belong." Jasmine said nothing. She didn't look at him. Her fingers closed over the paperback like it was a life vest in a storm. Gregory narrowed his eyes. "You deaf too," he snapped. "Or just rude?" Trevor stepped in. "Sir, we can't demand documentation from passengers once they're boarded. Please let it go." Gregory's voice dropped into a quieter, more venomous tone. "I paid $3,000 for this seat. I didn't pay to babysit a charity case." No one objected. Not Karen, not Trevor, not the passengers watching through lowered screens and half-hidden glances. Jasmine remained seated, her knuckles white, her breath shallow, her stomach curling with invisible bruises. The captain's voice broke over the intercom, announcing final boarding and departure within minutes. Gregory settled deeper into his seat with an audible exhale, like someone forced to tolerate a terrible smell. Then, in a low mutter, almost like an afterthought, he said, "I know a welfare face when I see one." Jasmine closed her eyes, her lashes wet, but no tear fell. She wouldn't give him that. The aircraft doors sealed with a dull thud, and the cabin lights dimmed to signal departure preparations. But the tension surrounding seat 2B remained electric. Gregory, still seething with unwarranted authority, wasn't done asserting dominance. He raised his voice slightly, not enough to violate protocol, just enough to ensure others could hear. "Well, I guess we're just handing out scholarships and sympathy now," he said as he loosened his watch and placed it pointedly on the shared armrest, its metal face scraping against Jasmine's elbow. She recoiled slightly but didn't speak. Karen returned with a firm look, clipboard in hand. "Miss," she said, voice flat, "I need to speak with you in private. Please come with me." Jasmine blinked in confusion, then glanced at Gregory, whose smug grin had returned in full. "This won't take long," Karen added, already stepping aside toward the front of the cabin. Jasmine gathered her book and backpack without a word, rising slowly while passengers openly stared. A few lowered their phones, others didn't bother hiding the fact they were recording. Her seatbelt clicked open with the sound of defeat. As she stood, Gregory immediately stretched out his legs, reclaiming the space like a victor staking his flag. "Finally," he muttered. "Some order." Karen led Jasmine past rows of silent witnesses, down the narrow aisle toward the front galley. Trevor followed behind, clearly uncomfortable but saying nothing. Once out of earshot from most passengers, Karen turned. "We need to clarify something with the ticketing system. It'll just be a moment." Jasmine nodded stiffly. She knew it was a lie. There was nothing to clarify. Her ticket had been scanned, confirmed, approved. But that didn't matter now. She had been moved, removed, marked. She stood silently beside a beverage cart while Trevor fiddled aimlessly with the tablet as if it were jammed. Karen busied herself straightening napkins, her back turned. Jasmine waited in full view of business-class passengers boarding through the side entrance, all of them glancing sideways at the girl in the hoodie, standing awkwardly next to the flight staff. She had become part of the equipment. Back in first class, Gregory had taken her seat completely. He reclined with dramatic flair, slipped his phone from his pocket, and began a casual call. "Yeah," he said loudly, "I'm up front. Just had to deal with some mix-up. They had a kid from the back trying to sit up here. Took care of it." He laughed, pausing to sip from the champagne Karen had never offered Jasmine. No, she didn't even argue. Just got up like a good little girl. He said it as if it were a compliment. Minutes dragged. Jasmine remained standing, hands curled around her book, eyes fixed on the carpet pattern. She tried to steady her breathing, but it kept catching in her chest. Not one person came to her side. Not one questioned why a teenage girl with a valid seat had been pulled away from it. Karen returned at last, avoiding Jasmine's gaze. "You'll be sitting in 23D for now," she said, "just while we finish sorting this out." Jasmine didn't protest. She followed Karen down the narrow corridor, past the curtain divider, past row after row of indifferent faces. Row 23 was near the back, beside the lavatories and directly in front of the rear galley. It smelled faintly of disinfectant and overused air filters. The seat was narrow, the legroom non-existent. She slid into it silently, shoved her bag beneath the seat, and pulled the book back into her lap. But she didn't open it. Somewhere at the front, Gregory's voice carried faintly over the hum of the engines. Told you. Some people just don't know their place. Jasmine sat frozen in seat 23D, her shoulders pressed tight against the armrests, her knees together, her bag untouched beneath her feet. The air around her felt thinner than it had minutes ago, not because of altitude, but because every breath now had to squeeze past the lump in her throat. She hadn't spoken since Karen escorted her out of first class, hadn't even looked up, not when the drinks cart passed, not when another passenger bumped her elbow retrieving a bag, not when Trevor walked by and deliberately avoided eye contact. At the front of the plane, Gregory swirled the last of his champagne and leaned slightly toward Karen as she adjusted the curtain separating first from business. Listen, I'm not trying to be difficult, he said with faux concern, but I've seen enough flights to know when something's off. You might want to check that girl's belongings. Just to be safe. These days, you can't be too careful. Sometimes people sneak things on board. And, well, she's been acting awfully nervous, clutching that bag like it's hiding something. He took a dramatic pause, then added in a lowered voice, Look, I'm just saying, if anything goes wrong, it's on you. Karen glanced toward the rear of the plane, her face expressionless, but Gregory's implication hung in the air like a poison fog. Moments later, Trevor was summoned by a short wave of her fingers. After a brief exchange in hushed tones, he nodded and made his way toward row 23. Jasmine didn't notice him at first. She was too busy staring at the seam in the seat back ahead of her, her eyes unfocused, her brain stuck somewhere between humiliation and disbelief. When Trevor finally stopped beside her and spoke her name, she looked up slowly, her body heavy. Miss Hill, he said with a rehearsed tone that carried no kindness, I'm going to need you to bring your backpack and follow me to the front galley. There's something we need to look into. Jasmine blinked once, then again, her hands gripping the straps of her backpack as if anchoring herself to the last piece of familiar ground. She stood without a word, without a question, without protest. She followed him down the aisle once again, passing the same indifferent faces, the same averted gazes. This time, there was no attempt to hide the stares. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else shifted uncomfortably in their seat. But no one said a word as the girl in the gray hoodie walked like a shadow back toward the front. When she stepped into the galley, Karen was already waiting. The narrow space felt colder than the rest of the cabin, metallic and clinical, as if it belonged more to a hospital than an aircraft. Karen pointed to the metal counter and said flatly, Set the bag here, please. Jasmine obeyed, placing it gently in front of her, the zipper already halfway open. Her fingers trembled slightly as she stepped back. Karen unzipped it fully and began removing items one by one. A paperback novel with curled corners, a USB charger wrapped neatly in a rubber band, a travel-sized bottle of lotion, a pencil case, a phone charger, a folded sweatshirt. Each item was placed carefully on the counter and examined, not roughly, but not respectfully either. There was no explanation, no reassurance, only a cold efficiency that treated her things like evidence and her presence like an inconvenience. When Karen reached a small pouch tucked into the side pocket, she opened it and revealed a barely used asthma inhaler and a half-empty bottle of eye drops. She turned them over in her hands, as if unsure whether they were real or staged. Jasmine stood still, her eyes locked on the wall behind Karen, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her breaths shallow and uneven. Karen looked at her. Did you pack this bag yourself? She asked. Jasmine nodded. Yes. Her voice was quiet, but clear. Karen didn't respond. She simply continued her inspection. Then, without turning around, she spoke to Trevor. Call Mr. Daniels. Trevor stepped away. Jasmine remained standing, her eyes still fixed on the same spot. She could hear the murmurs from beyond the curtain, the sound of the coffee pot heating, the metallic tap of ice cubes being poured into tumblers, but it all felt distant. She was no longer a passenger. She was a problem, a possible threat, a disruption wrapped in a teenage body and dark skin. When Mr. Daniels arrived, he stepped into the galley with an air of control, his tie straight, his expression unreadable. He scanned the items on the counter, then looked at Jasmine. "We've received a concern from another passenger," he began, as if the words excused everything that followed. "We're just doing our due diligence to make sure all items comply with federal aviation guidelines." Jasmine didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Daniels looked to Karen. "Anything out of place?" She shook her head. "No prohibited items so far, but I'd like to check the lining." Jasmine flinched. Daniels raised a hand slightly. "That won't be necessary unless we have a specific trigger. At this point, we'll classify it as resolved." Karen nodded and began placing Jasmine's belongings back into the backpack, one item at a time, though not with the care she had removed them. When she handed it back, Jasmine accepted it without meeting her eyes. "Please return to your seat," Daniel said. "Thank you for cooperating." Jasmine turned around slowly, her feet heavy, her shoulders still rigid. She walked back through first class, through the curtain, through business, back to her assigned spot in economy, her hands clutching the backpack like armor. She sat down in 23D without looking at anyone, placed her bag beneath the seat, and stared ahead at nothing. She felt hollowed out, not by what had been said, but by what had been implied, by the way they looked at her, the way they touched her things, the way they spoke with politeness that stung worse than insults. She didn't cry. She didn't sigh. She just sat there, breathing carefully, willing herself to become smaller than the seat, smaller than the air around her, small enough to disappear. She had no allies. Not in the air, not in this cabin, not even in the rules that were supposedly designed to protect passengers equally. She had followed every instruction, complied with every command, and still found herself labeled suspicious, dangerous, wrong. From behind her, the murmurs started like whispers sliding beneath the cabin noise, subtle but slicing. A man 2 rows back leaned toward the woman beside him, lowering his voice just enough to remain cruel while pretending to be discreet. "You saw how tight she was gripping that bag? I wouldn't be surprised if they pulled her off before landing. These kids grow up with no respect for authority." The woman nodded, her voice laced with false concern. She looked hostile. "I mean, if she had nothing to hide, why'd she act so cold? I've worked with teenagers. They don't act like that unless they're hiding something." A few rows ahead, an older couple in matching cashmere travel sets shook their heads slowly, as if they'd witnessed some tragic breach of etiquette. "I just don't understand what's happening to flying," the man whispered. "Used to be a certain standard. Now it feels like anyone with a discount code can squeeze in next to you." The woman patted his hand sympathetically, glancing down the aisle toward Jasmine with a practiced blend of disapproval and pity. "She's probably on a program," she replied. "You know, the diversity scholarships. Bless her heart, but that's not the same as paying full fare." Their voices were soft, but Jasmine felt them like heat against her skin. Her senses were sharpened by everything that had happened. Her brain cataloged every sideways glance, every throat clear, every whisper that followed her like a shadow across the cabin. The divide wasn't just in class, it was in perception, in the way people chose to interpret the same facts. In first class, Gregory had his own version of events, one he began sharing freely. "Yeah, they pulled her bag," he said casually to the businessman seated beside him. "Had to. I told the flight crew something fell off. I don't mean to brag, but you get a sense for these things when you travel this much. She just didn't belong, you know? Her energy was off. I don't know if it's attitude or upbringing, but something wasn't right." The businessman didn't respond directly, but gave a small, approving grunt. Gregory took that as confirmation and continued. "It's not about race. It's about order. This is a premium cabin. It's not daycare." In the seat diagonally behind them, a young woman had captured snippets of the earlier scene on her phone. She'd recorded Jasmine standing awkwardly in the galley, her face blank, her arms crossed as Karen searched the bag. The video had no sound, but it zoomed in on Jasmine's stiff posture and unreadable expression. Later, the woman added subtitles. "Aggressive teen detained mid-flight." She posted it to her social feed with a caption, "Unbelievable. This girl tried to force her way into first class, then acted like she was the victim. Entitled much." Within minutes, it began gaining traction. Comments rolled in fast, most siding with the narrative. few questioning its accuracy. This is why we can't have nice things. She looks like she was ready to throw a tantrum. Bet she was recording the whole thing for TikTok clout. No one asked who she was. No one asked what happened before the camera started rolling. The narrative had already taken shape, and Jasmine had no say in it. Even the crew had begun treating her with altered politeness, the kind that masks unease rather than compassion. Karen walked past once more, delivering snacks to passengers in row 22. She didn't look at Jasmine, didn't offer water, didn't apologize. Trevor glanced at her as he poured ginger ale for someone else, but said nothing. His eyes skipped right over her, like she was no longer part of the manifest. In this airborne ecosystem, Jasmine had been successfully reclassified from passenger to problem, from girl to disruption, from child to threat. A man across the aisle, probably in his 40s, leaned slightly toward her row and whispered, "Next time try booking economy like the rest of us. First class isn't a charity." Jasmine didn't react. She didn't flinch. She kept her eyes forward, spine straight, fists clenched on her knees beneath the tray table. Inside her mind, 100 responses burned to be spoken, but she buried them deep. There was no safety in speaking. Not here. Not now. She had learned that lesson the hard way. Every breath she took became quieter, smaller, less noticeable. She shrank into the seat without changing her posture, trying to disappear without moving, to fade without vanishing. Behind her, the whispers kept growing, not louder, but more confident. The doubt had become consensus. A woman in row 21 turned to her friend and said plainly, she made everyone uncomfortable. You could feel it. I don't care what the paperwork says. Sometimes you just know. Her friend nodded. She has an attitude. You can see it in her face. That was the story now. That she had an attitude. That she had done something wrong. That her silence was evidence. That her existence was defiance. Gregory, meanwhile, basked in the quiet confirmation of his actions. He leaned back, tapped out an email on his phone, then began explaining to a new passenger who had just returned from the restroom how he had to step in to protect the integrity of the cabin. I didn't yell, he said. Didn't even raise my voice. I just calmly let the crew know we had a situation. I mean, that's leadership, right? If no one else is going to enforce standards, I will. The passenger nodded politely, unsure how to respond. Gregory mistook that for agreement and kept going. She looked angry from the moment she sat down, and she didn't say a word, which is even more suspicious. When kids are quiet like that, it's never good. His expression was stiff, deliberately impersonal, as if rehearsed. He stopped beside her seat, crouched slightly to speak without drawing too much attention, and began in a clipped, rehearsed tone that barely masked his discomfort. Miss Hill, the flight crew has completed its review of the earlier disruption, and we're required by protocol to document any incident involving passenger movement and compliance checks. Jasmine looked at him, her eyes dry now, hollowed out by exhaustion, her voice absent. He opened the folder, revealing a form titled Passenger Conduct Incident Report. The text was small and dense, with boxes already checked. One line had her name printed in block letters. Another listed the category, non-compliance/perceived disruption. Trevor continued, "We'll need you to sign at the bottom acknowledging you've been informed of the report. It's not an admission of wrongdoing. It's just to show that we've discussed it with you." Jasmine didn't move. She stared at the paper like it was written in a foreign language, though she understood every word. She reached for the pen slowly, hesitated, then placed it back down. Her silence wasn't protest anymore, it was armor. Trevor's posture tensed. If you don't sign, it may trigger a notation in your traveler profile that can result in delayed boarding or future travel restrictions. The message was clear: sign it or face long-term punishment. Jasmine didn't argue. She took the pen again, signed her name slowly at the bottom, her handwriting careful, her signature barely more than a whisper. When she handed it back, Trevor gave a small nod, said nothing else, and walked away. Across the aisle, the man who had whispered earlier leaned toward his wife and muttered, "They probably had to report it. Can't just let behavior like that slide." His wife agreed, her arms folded tightly. It's the principle. If they let her get away with it, others will think they can do the same. You have to make an example sometimes. Jasmine heard none of it directly, but she felt every syllable, absorbed every sideways glance, every smug shake of a head. The judgment had soaked into the air like pressurized perfume, cold, sharp, undeniable. Minutes passed. Then Gregory stood up again. He stretched in the aisle, rolled his shoulders dramatically, and sauntered toward the back of the cabin under the guise of using the restroom. But he made a detour. He stopped at Jasmine's row and rested one hand on the headrest beside her, leaning slightly into her personal space, a smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes. "I saw the form," he said, voice low enough to sound like casual conversation, loud enough to sting. "Guess they had to put something on the record." "Huh? Don't feel bad. First-class expectations can be confusing at your age." Jasmine didn't respond. Her eyes stayed forward. Gregory's smile widened. "Where are your parents, anyway? They let you fly alone? Or, wait, maybe you don't have anyone checking in on you. That would explain a lot. Some people just don't get taught where they belong." Jasmine still didn't speak. She wouldn't. Not to him. Not here. Not when she knew how this game was played. He leaned closer, his cologne thick in the air, his words sharp enough to cut. "You know what I think," he said. "I think you believed one little ticket could change your place in the world. That's cute. But sweetheart, a window seat doesn't rewrite reality." She blinked once, but kept her face still. Gregory let out a soft chuckle. "Well, don't worry. You'll remember this flight. I promise." He straightened up, adjusted his collar, and walked to the lavatory, satisfied with his performance. In his mind, it wasn't bullying, it was correction, order, enforcement. He didn't hate her. He just didn't think she belonged where she had dared to sit. Back in first class, he resumed his seat with a smirk. Nearby passengers gave him polite nods, affirming his return, affirming his view of what had just happened. Karen walked past him and murmured, "Everything handled?" Gregory nodded. Like clockwork. Karen said nothing else. She continued her route, stepping past a row of champagne glasses and settling into the familiar rhythm of service. Jasmine sat still for another hour, unmoving, her body locked in place while her thoughts screamed against the silence. The report lived in her lap like a scar. Her name now existed in the airline system as a mark, a file, a warning. She hadn't spoken a word in hours, and yet her silence had been interpreted as defiance, her calm as arrogance, her presence as provocation. This wasn't about a seat anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. It was about the audacity to be unashamed in a space people like Gregory believed should remain untouched by girls like her. Somewhere above the clouds, in the quiet back of a plane designed for status and separation, Jasmine sat surrounded by strangers who had all, in one way or another, voted silently against her. The signature line bore her name, written in ink that still hadn't fully dried, a permanent reminder of a verdict passed without a voice raised in her defense. Her backpack, the same one they'd searched, lay inert beneath the seat in front of her, zipped now, but not whole. Something had shifted in the weight of it, nothing physical, but it no longer felt like hers. Not truly, not safe. She stared at the blank screen of the seatback monitor in front of her, not watching, not thinking, just existing in a suspended state between numbness and restraint. Her body obeyed stillness like it was law. Her thoughts screamed inside her chest like they were trying to claw their way out. The air and economy felt even more suffocating than before. The conversations around her faded into static. The more people acted normal, the more disconnected she felt. Normal didn't exist anymore. Not in this cabin. Not in this skin. Not after that clipboard. Her fingers slipped into the side pocket of her hoodie and found her phone, the edges cool, familiar. She unlocked it with a trembling thumb and opened the text thread labeled Dad. There were no recent messages. Just to be safe he had sent the night before, and a short "love you" she had never replied to because her brain had been too crowded with packing and check-in and choosing between sneakers and boots. She stared at the blinking cursor for a long moment. Then she typed 4 words. "Dad, I need you." She didn't send anything else. No context, no explanation, just the truth, distilled down to its most desperate form. She hit send. A moment later, the message showed delivered. Nothing came back. The screen dimmed. She slipped the phone back into her pocket without waiting. She didn't expect a reply, not right away. She knew where he was, in the middle of a meeting with federal contractors. That was why she'd flown ahead. That was why she was alone. Her father had trusted the airline, trusted the ticket, trusted the process. But processes didn't protect girls like her, not when authority could be bent by tone and tailored suits and pale smiles. Jasmine closed her eyes. She wasn't crying. She was breathing. Deep, slow, careful breaths, the kind they teach in school assemblies under banners about resilience and self-control. From the front of the plane, Gregory strolled back from a lavatory, returning like a man who had just conquered something beneath him. He glanced in her direction as he passed and offered a small, smug nod, the kind that said you've learned your place. She didn't meet his eyes. She didn't flinch. But inside, something twisted. A muscle of something buried, so deep it hadn't moved in years, suddenly tensed. Gregory paused near the curtain to first class and spoke loud enough for two nearby passengers to hear. She's been real quiet since signing that form. Guess some people only understand discipline in print. One of the passengers chuckled. The other shifted uncomfortably. Gregory added with mock sympathy, "Don't worry. She's back where she belongs now. Let's hope she doesn't end up on a no-fly list." He returned to his seat with satisfaction smeared across his face. He thought it was over. Jasmine let him think that. The plane hit a patch of light turbulence. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, and the captain's voice came over the intercom with routine instructions. Jasmine barely heard it. Her hand was wrapped tightly around the phone in her pocket, not because she was waiting for a reply. She wasn't. But because it was the only tether she had to someone who believed her, without needing proof. Her father would come. She didn't know when. She didn't know how. But he would. Another 20 minutes passed. A junior flight attendant named Rachel came down the aisle offering water and pretzels. She stopped at Jasmine's row, glanced briefly at the folded form still visible on the tray table, and hesitated. "Would you like?" she began, but Jasmine shook her head once. Rachel nodded and moved on without another word. From behind, someone took a photo. The soft click of a phone camera shutter was barely audible, but Jasmine noticed. She turned her head slightly and caught the middle-aged woman in 24A quickly, tilting her phone away. The woman smiled awkwardly and offered a casual excuse. "Just documenting how they treat passengers back here," she said, but her voice held no sincerity. Jasmine didn't respond. She didn't believe it, and they both knew that. Farther down the cabin, someone played a video with a sound just loud enough to carry across several rows. Jasmine recognized the footage immediately. It was the clip from earlier, the one where she stood beside Karen in the galley while her backpack was searched. She could see herself in the frame, silent, expressionless, alone. The subtitle beneath the image read, "Uncooperative teen delays flight security." Someone behind her snorted. Another person muttered, "Of course." A young man 2 rows ahead turned in his seat to get a better look at her face, as if comparing her to the girl in the video, trying to see if she really looked dangerous. Jasmine stayed still. If she moved, if she spoke, she would only confirm their suspicions. If she stood, they would see threat. If she cried, they would see guilt. So she stayed silent, still, cold. Gregory, from the front, leaned into the aisle again and made another passing comment to the flight attendant. "She's not causing problems now, right? Just want to make sure she doesn't try something during landing." Karen gave a non-committal smile. She didn't correct him, didn't defend Jasmine, didn't acknowledge how wrong it was. And that silence echoed louder than any accusation. Jasmine felt the vibration in her legs before she heard anything. She reached for her phone. The screen lit up. There it was, a single message from her dad. "Where are you exactly?" That was all he sent. No punctuation, no panic, just a quiet question from a man who knew how to move without noise. Jasmine stared at the words, her heart finally beginning to beat in a rhythm she recognized, not of fear, but of hope forged in fire. She typed back, "Rear economy. Row 23. Flight 884. We haven't taken off yet." She hit send. Then she placed the phone down gently on the tray table, her fingers no longer shaking. She wasn't safe yet. She wasn't free. But she had sent the signal, and someone who actually mattered had heard it. The final boarding call echoed faintly through the jet bridge as the cabin crew completed last-minute checks. Karen walked briskly toward the cockpit to confirm passenger count, glancing briefly at her tablet screen as the cabin door began to seal. Row 23 remained quiet, Jasmine unmoving, her eyes fixed on the seatback in front of her, her hand resting lightly on her phone. The message from her father sat there like a weight. "Where are you exactly?" She had replied with everything he needed: flight number, row, cabin. No emojis, no panic, just facts. The silence that followed was absolute. The mechanical hiss of the aircraft door retracting startled everyone. The flight had been on the verge of departure. Karen spun on her heel, confused. Trevor turned from the galley. Even Gregory, lounging in his reclined seat in 2A, perked up with mild irritation. Someone was coming aboard. A man stepped onto the aircraft alone. He didn't speak to the gate agent. He didn't glance around. He simply moved forward with the quiet authority of someone used to walking into closed rooms and being the final word inside them. He was tall, with dark skin and broad shoulders. His suit was black, sharply pressed, his shirt crisp and buttoned to the collar. The only accessory on his person was a federal badge clipped to his belt and a matte black phone in his hand. Jasmine looked up, and in that 1 second, her posture changed. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. But her shoulders uncurled slightly, and her fingers eased their grip on the edge of the tray table. Her father was here. Marcus Hill paused halfway down the aisle, his eyes sweeping the cabin with surgical precision. His gaze didn't linger on the luxury seats or the uniformed crew. He was scanning, calculating. Then he saw her in the back, row 23, hoodie drawn tight, face still, eyes fixed forward. A single glance between them said more than 1,000 words. She hadn't cried. She hadn't called. But he knew. And now he was here. Karen stepped forward, attempting to regain control. "Sir, we've already closed boarding. May I ask?" Marcus pulled a card holder from his inner pocket and flipped it open. The gold badge inside gleamed beneath the cabin lights. FBI Federal Bureau of Investigation. His voice was calm, but firm. "Special Agent Marcus Hill. I'm joining this flight under urgent family grounds. There's been a passenger report I need to verify." Karen blinked, stunned. I wasn't notified." Marcus's tone didn't shift. "You're notified now." He walked past her without waiting for permission. The air inside the cabin shifted. A quiet ripple of unease spread among the passengers. Gregory, who had been only half interested, sat up straighter, his brow furrowed. He watched the man make his way toward the rear of the plane. When Marcus reached row 23, he didn't speak right away. He simply placed one hand on the top of Jasmine's seat and looked down at her. "You good?" he asked quietly. She nodded once, barely moving. He turned to the passenger in the adjacent seat. "Excuse me." The man stood without hesitation, moving aside quickly as Marcus took the now vacant seat beside his daughter. He didn't embrace her. He didn't raise his voice. He just sat there for a moment, processing. "Tell me everything," he said. Jasmine spoke not with emotion, but with precision. She recounted the seat dispute, the accusations, the bag search, the form she was forced to sign, the stares, the whispers. She didn't embellish. She didn't editorialize. She just delivered the details, one after another, like a report. Marcus listened in silence. His face remained unreadable, but his jaw tightened once, subtly. When she finished, he asked a single question. "Did anyone intervene?" She shook her head. He nodded, stood, and turned down the aisle. Karen was waiting. She opened her mouth, but Marcus beat her to it. "You had a minor with a valid first-class ticket removed without cause. You had her subjected to a personal item search under zero legal justification. You had her documented for a compliance violation based solely on a passenger complaint. His voice was low, calm, deadly in its precision. Karen straightened, defensive. "Sir, the passenger raised concerns, and our crew followed protocol to ensure safety. Show me her original seat assignment." Marcus cut in. Karen fumbled with her tablet, fingers tapping nervously. It was 2B. Marcus turned his head slightly. "So, 2A was the complainant?" "Yes," Karen replied quickly, clearly realizing where this was going. Marcus stepped around her without another word and headed for the front of the cabin. Trevor tried to stop him, but Marcus ignored him completely. The curtain separating business and first class swung aside as Marcus approached row 2. Gregory looked up from his phone, confused, then smug again when he saw the suit. "If this is about the girl," he began, "I already explained everything to the crew." She was being uncooperative. Marcus pulled his badge again, holding it at eye level. "Gregory West. I'm Special Agent Marcus Hill. Jasmine Hill is my daughter. I've reviewed the passenger manifest. She paid for 2B. This seat beside you belongs to her. You had her removed. You triggered a false security concern. You watched her be publicly searched and humiliated, all while you occupied a seat you did not pay for." Marcus's tone remained even, but each word dropped with the weight of judgment. Gregory opened his mouth, searching for a defense. "I was just trying to make sure." Marcus leaned in slightly. "Save it for the report. You're going to disembark this aircraft immediately. You'll be detained for questioning regarding the false complaint and potential violation of federal anti-discrimination aviation laws." Karen stepped forward, panicked. "Wait, this isn't necessary. It was just a misunderstanding." Marcus turned on her. "Your crew failed to confirm credentials. You took the word of a single passenger over documented evidence. You filed a conduct report against a minor without speaking to her guardian. You violated Federal Carrier Responsibility Code 23B." Trevor was already moving toward the intercom. Gregory stammered, "Wait, you can't. I know people. You should have known who she was sitting next to," Marcus said coldly. "But more importantly, you should have known what kind of man you were talking to when you made her stand up." Gregory slumped in his seat. His power had evaporated. Marcus stepped aside. The captain, now informed, approached with 2 airline officials in tow. Gregory was told to gather his belongings. Karen was instructed to remain in the galley for the remainder of the flight pending a formal report. As Marcus turned and made his way back down the aisle, the entire cabin had fallen silent. First class, business, economy. Every passenger who had whispered, chuckled, recorded, now watched him return to row 23, sit beside his daughter, and say only this: "It's handled." The tension inside the cabin remained thick, like a current hanging in the pressurized air long after storm. Marcus sat beside his daughter in row 23, his presence calming, but not passive. His posture was upright, his phone still in his palm, face locked in unreadable resolve. Jasmine hadn't said anything since he returned. She didn't need to. The balance of the cabin had shifted. The silence wasn't from shock anymore, it was from fear. Not of Marcus's badge, but of what his presence meant. That what had happened wasn't over. It was just beginning. Gregory hadn't been escorted off the plane yet. He remained in his seat in first class, pale and visibly sweating, checking his phone, then pocketing it, then checking again, like he was waiting for a call that would never come. Karen stood stiffly near the galley, her hands clasped tightly behind her back, eyes no longer scanning the cabin with control, but darting from shadow to shadow like someone trapped in a room where the lights kept flickering. Marcus stood again. This time, he didn't need to force space. Passengers parted in the aisle as if some instinct told them to. He walked with that same slow, deliberate energy that felt heavier than volume. He stopped in the galley, turned toward the flight supervisor, and spoke with calm authority. "I want the full manifest for this flight. Printed. Now." The supervisor hesitated, then retrieved the tablet. Marcus took it, scrolled quickly, eyes tracking. He found what he needed. Passenger 2B. Jasmine Hill. Ticket purchased under government federal account, he read aloud. That's a pre-cleared VIP tier profile, Department of Justice verified, assigned through the Federal Personnel Travel Program. Now tell me, why was that seat taken from her? He looked directly at Karen. You had this information at check-in. She was tagged priority clearance. Did no one read it? Karen swallowed hard, her voice cracking slightly. It didn't show in the seat reassignment screen, Marcus interrupted, his voice cool and sharp. It did. You just didn't look. You assumed. He turned the tablet around so that everyone in earshot could see. Here. Jasmine Hill, age 17, DOJ clearance level 2, escort waiver on file. You moved a federally vetted minor from a registered seat based on the unsolicited complaint of a man who had no assigned seat in that row. And then you filed a disciplinary report against her, under my name. The silence was deafening. Karen tried again. We were acting in the interest of safety. The complaint, you acted in the interest of stereotype, Marcus snapped, his voice still controlled, but harder now, colder. You treated my daughter like a threat. You ignored verified credentials. You trusted the man who shouted first. Not the record, not the scanner, not the truth. Then Marcus pulled out his phone. Would you like to see the truth? He tapped the screen, opened his camera roll, and selected a video. It began with Jasmine seated in first class. Gregory's voice came through clearly. I'm just saying, she doesn't look like someone who paid full price. The video had been captured discreetly by a quiet passenger seated across the aisle. Someone who had been watching, recording not for clout, but for protection. The footage showed Gregory waving over Karen, insisting the girl was a mix-up, questioning her presence, her clothing, even her skin. Another clip showed him turning to another passenger and whispering, "It's not about race, but let's be honest. When's the last time you saw one of them up here, not serving drinks?" The supervisor stiffened. Karen turned pale. Marcus turned the phone outward, holding it up like evidence in a trial. This is what your crew responded to. This is the basis for everything that happened today. And you rewarded it with action. You humiliated my daughter. You endangered her. You left a minor without proper adult supervision in an unsecured part of the aircraft while defending the man who made those remarks. Trevor stepped forward from behind the galley wall. He had been listening the entire time, face blank, but his shoulders had dropped. Now finally he spoke. I didn't know, he said quietly. I didn't realize she was. You didn't need to know who she was, Marcus replied sharply. You just needed to follow the protocol. But the moment someone made her presence uncomfortable, she became disposable. Gregory, from his seat, suddenly stood and barked out, "This is ridiculous. I didn't say anything illegal. I was just concerned. I felt unsafe. That's allowed, right?" Marcus didn't even turn around. He raised his voice enough to carry across the cabin. Feeling uncomfortable doesn't give you the right to fabricate a threat. You didn't feel unsafe. You felt entitled. There's a difference. And when you use that entitlement to move people out of spaces you think they don't belong in, people who do belong, you're not just rude. You're dangerous. The captain appeared at the front of the plane, informed by the supervisor about the severity of the situation. He approached Gregory directly. "Sir, you'll need to disembark immediately. You are no longer welcome on this flight." Gregory sputtered. "I'm a platinum member." "You can't, you're a liability," the captain said, his voice cold. "And this airline doesn't protect liars. Or racists." Gregory's protests faded as he was escorted toward the jet bridge by airport security, who had been called moments earlier under Marcus's instruction. His steps were unsteady. His voice grew smaller. No one clapped. No one jeered. The silence itself was the sentence. Marcus turned back to the galley. "And as for this crew, I expect a formal written apology on record before Wheels Up. Not just for Jasmine, but for the breach of protocol and ethics that happened here today." The supervisor nodded. Karen didn't speak. Marcus returned to row 23, took his seat beside Jasmine again, and exhaled slowly. He didn't speak right away. He simply leaned forward, opened the tray table, and pulled out her folded compliance form. He tore it in half once, then again, and again. until it was nothing but pieces. "You're clear," he said quietly. "Completely." Jasmine looked at the torn paper, then at him. Her voice finally came back, small but steady. "Thank you." Marcus nodded. "Next time, we fly together. No exceptions." Gregory's shoes scraped across the carpeted jet bridge as two uniformed officers flanked him on either side, their grips firm, their expressions flat. His voice rang out, indignant, desperate, but no longer commanding. "I'm a shareholder. I'll sue this entire airline. Do you know who I am?" His blazer shifted awkwardly over his wrinkled shirt as he stumbled, pulled toward the terminal. Marcus stood silently at the threshold of the aircraft door, watching him go. His arms were crossed. His jaw was tight, but his eyes remained steady, unreadable. He didn't respond to Gregory's shouts. He didn't need to. The badge on his belt said everything. Karen remained near the galley, pale, her hands clasped at her sides like a child awaiting punishment. The supervisor spoke softly into a headset, murmuring to ground control. Trevor hovered nearby, trying to stay invisible. The atmosphere was no longer just tense, it was radioactive. Every movement had weight, every word consequence. As the officers disappeared with Gregory into the terminal, the captain approached Marcus quietly. "Thank you for stepping in," he said, voice low but sincere. "We've issued a permanent flight ban on Mr. West. He won't be boarding with us or any U.S. partner airline again." Marcus gave a nod. He shouldn't have boarded this one. The captain hesitated, then added, "We've also notified TSA and the FAA. There's an open case regarding prior in-flight behavior involving racial harassment." His name flagged in a secondary database, but no one here checked it. Marcus didn't react outwardly, but Jasmine saw his fist tighten at his side. It wasn't just today. Gregory had done this before, and people had let him. Meanwhile, Karen had been quietly handed a document by the supervisor. She scanned it quickly, and the moment her eyes reached the final paragraph, her body sank by half an inch. It was a formal notice. Temporary suspension pending investigation. She would not be completing this flight. Another attendant would be flown in to meet the aircraft at its next stop. She didn't speak. She didn't argue. She simply placed the paper down and walked into the galley, her shadow vanishing behind the curtain like a chapter closing in shame. Back in economy, passengers whispered, not with mockery now, but with awe, with clarity, with guilt. The man who had laughed earlier now sat silently, his eyes locked on the back of the seat in front of him. The woman who'd whispered about certain standards turned her face to the window, her reflection looking smaller than she remembered. One of the younger passengers who'd been filming discreetly deleted their video. And in row 23, Jasmine sat upright, her tray table clear, her eyes steady. Marcus returned to his seat beside her. For the first time since she boarded, she didn't shrink into herself. She didn't fold her arms. She didn't hide. The shadow that had followed her from the first minute had lifted, piece by piece, and what was left was something sharper. Not safety. Not yet, but strength. She leaned slightly toward her father and said quietly but firmly, "I want to go back to my seat." He stood, helped her gather her things, and together they walked the length of the cabin. This time, no one looked away. No one whispered. They watched, some with respect, some with regret, others with uncertainty, but no one stopped her. She reached row 2, her seat, to be empty, waiting. Marcus pulled back the curtain for her, and she stepped through. The leather felt no different beneath her. The seatbelt still clicked the same, but the air around her had changed. She wasn't there by accident anymore. She wasn't there as a tolerated presence. She was there because she belonged. Marcus stood beside her for a moment longer before turning to the captain. "You have everything you need," he said. "I'll be filing an official statement with DOJ and the Office of Civil Rights Aviation Division." The captain nodded. "We'll cooperate fully." Then Marcus returned to row 23, his original seat still warm, his presence still felt. The engines began to spool. The captain's voice came over the intercom with calm authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, we thank you for your patience. We've resolved an unexpected delay and are now cleared for departure. Flight 884 is now taxiing." He paused, then added something extra. "We'd also like to thank Special Agent Hill for his assistance. Let this serve as a reminder. Respect is not optional. It's required." It started soft. Then another joined in. Then another. And suddenly, row by row, passenger by passenger, the cabin erupted into applause. Not loud, not forced, but real. A sound that acknowledged something had happened here that mattered. That truth had found a voice. That someone had stood up for the right person, in the right way, at the right time. Jasmine didn't look around. She didn't cry. She just stared out the window as the plane lifted off, her reflection steadier than it had been at the gate. The city below grew smaller, but inside her, something larger had just taken root. Not pride, not victory, but proof. Proof that silence wasn't weakness. That injustice could be named. That power, when used right, could be louder than any prejudice. And above all, proof that she had never been alone. The end. What would you have done if you were Jasmine or Marcus? Have you ever witnessed injustice like this while traveling? Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing your stories from around the world. If this story hit you right in the heart, give it a like, subscribe for more powerful stories like this, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded. Power doesn't always come from volume. Sometimes it comes from knowing who's got your back.